So, a really important concept here is rape culture. And to be clear, what this means is not the fact that there is a lot of rape going on in our culture, which is true and is obviously a problem, but that's not what the phrase rape culture refers to. What it refers to is the existence of a set of ideas and socializations and social constructions around rape that make it easier for rapists to engage in their behavior, that make it harder for survivors to get justice, to get healing. And so rape culture enables and protects abusers, and it blames and punishes survivors. So it's about the things that happen not with rape itself, but all the things that happen around rape, what happens afterwards, what happens before, what happens when we talk about it, and how we talk about it. Some examples of this. We've talked about slut shaming, and we talked about how that's a direct step to victim blaming, to the idea that it's the fault of women in particular for how they dress, how they act, for what happens, what rapists do to them. The use of rape jokes, trivializing rape, something like, oh, that, midterm really raped me or whatever, right? To use analogies to rape, to things that are not violence. It makes rape seem less serious, makes it seem like something that can be funny, can be laughed about. One place you especially see this is with sex workers. The idea of like the dead hooker or whatever as a joke, which is a thing. And also, in particular, jokes about prison rape, when there's a whole video in this series about that topic, but that's often a thing that is joked about as if it's something that is funny or even that is just. That's the correct thing to happen. Victim blaming, right? Blaming the victim for how she was dressing, what she was doing, all those kind of things. We know that none of those things are true, first of all. Rapists do all kinds of different ways of finding their victims and targeting their victims, and it's certainly not just women who are dressed in a whatever provocative manner. It's certainly not just women who are in out late at night alone or something. They do all kinds of different things to find victims, and often prey on some of the ways that people might feel safer. Finding excuses for the perpetrators, right? Saying that, oh, she let him on, or that, he can't control himself, the boys will be boys idea, right? Trying to minimize his actions. He didn't really know what he was doing or how much he was hurting her. Concern for the perpetrators, right? Worried about what this will do to their life, or, the promising athletic career. You may know the case of Brock Turner, right? The focus on false allegations. It is true that sometimes people make false allegations of sexual violence. It's not more common than in other crimes. The rate is around about 3 to 5% is the false accusation rate, report rate for all crime, and the false report rate for sexual violence is about the same. But what the media sometimes does, and what rape culture does, is over focus on those, make it seem like those are far more normal than they are, that they're the real tragedy, the thing that we need to think about. So that makes it seem like false allegations are more likely and makes people doubt real allegations. In the case of male survivors, attacking their masculinity, the idea that this means that they're gay or that they're not, real men, that they were not able to fight back, as if fighting back is a, successful strategy, which repeated research has shown that it is not, sadly. And, trivializing, similarly the idea that, like, men can't be raped. The use of the threat of rape as a weapon, you see this, any woman who speaks out politically on the internet will receive rape threats. It's a standard tactic used to try and silence women. Objectification, again, that we talked about that last week, how that connects here. There's also important events, structures that support rape. In particular, war is commonly source of rape. The war on drugs has been a way that, in particular, men have been given power in law enforcement, and that has men have used that to perpetrate sexual violence. And then we have the idea of rape as an expression of sexual desire, as the idea that rape shows how much a man wants to have sex with a woman, that's what's going on here, right? Is that the man wants it so badly, but that she has turned him down or whatever, so that he just has to do this. Or sometimes the idea you'll hear that rapists are sexually frustrated, right? That it's because they're not getting sex that they're doing this, more generally. And then also the idea that a woman who is not sexually desirable in the traditional sense wouldn't be a rape victim, and this is something that rape victims who are women with size will hear, you're too fat to be raped, that you're too ugly to be raped, is something that is often said to rape victims. And again, apart from being a horrible thing to say, it's not supported by the evidence. Rapists are not raping out of sexual desire, as I mentioned in the previous video. Many of them have access to consensual sex, and then they target the elderly. They target they pick their targets on the basis of who they think they can get away with hurting, and who they can successfully hurt. It's not based on whether they desire them or not. And then also the idea that rape is somehow natural or inevitable. You will hear this from kind of conservative intellectuals sometimes, the Ben Shapiro types, this idea that this is just kind of part of human nature or human biology to desire this, that it shows up in the natural world, which is true, it does in some mammals. And that, it's inevitable, that, it's always going to be there, yeah, it's sad, but there's nothing we can do about it. Right, plays into rape culture. And I mean, I think that it is true that part of human nature appears to be, whatever that is, a desire to hurt other people, sometimes a desire to exercise power. But that's a very reductive view of human nature, because human nature also contains the desire to care for each other, the desire to look after the weak, right, the desire to form communities and work together. In fact, that's been the predominant success of humanity, is that drive to cooperate. And we make decisions all the time about whether we're going to follow our desires, right? It's, it might be human nature to, eat as much butter as you have access to because you need to prepare for the winter or whatever, right? But we obviously don't do that because we have understand what the consequence will be. It's natural behavior to just poop or pee whenever you want to anywhere, but we have decided to have bathrooms where we go off in private to do it, and that's great. So the fact that something is human nature or natural is a terrible excuse for doing it. I mean, yeah. So what all that adds up to is, again, creating this cultural sense that rape is okay, that rape is just going to be a thing that happens, that it's not as serious as it is, that we can excuse it, right, that it's in fact the fault of victims. And all of these work together to make life easier for rapists, to make it easier for them to rape, and then make it easier for them to get away with it, to avoid consequences. Many of these things show up in court cases as a way that the lawyers of rapists will defend them, some of them successfully, for example. An important thing to talk about with rape culture in the US right now is the president. He has raped several women. He has a whole series of women that he has sexually harassed. The sexual harassment is something that he has bragged about on tape. I don't think there's any doubt that this has happened by, serious observers. And you have this whole series of quotes from him, of course. And you see a lot of this rape culture arguments made by him publicly. This idea that, it's just kind of normal boy stuff to be talking about women in that way, that, normal masculinity, this idea of talking about masculinity as a particular type of masculinity is admirable, right? The idea that women want it. Also, he has called women ugly and said that, the accusation can't be true because she's ugly. And, he also has this whole thing with younger women and going into the locker rooms of Miss Teen USA or Miss Teen Universe, whatever the name of the competitions are, and his connection to Jeffrey Epstein and the quotes here. But again, the thing that is astounding about this in terms of rape culture is how, a huge number of people justified that, excused that, support him anyway, continue to support him anyway, despite this evidence. And, he's also not the only president, just the most severe example of this. There's certainly, evidence that Bill Clinton and several other previous presidents have engaged in, not to this level of frequency, but similar behavior. I don't have a good place to put this, so this is an important list to consider that to talk about here is with domestic abuse and some of the signs of that. People who create fear in a relationship, who make you feel small, who isolate people. So a common strategy by abusers is to isolate the person they're abusing from their support structure, right? It's just us against the world. Your parents don't care about you. Your friends, hate you. Being jealous of friends and not letting them see them, right? Controlling all kinds of things, how they dress and so forth. The putting blame on the person who is being abused for the abuser's feelings. So like, oh, you just make me so angry, right? The idea that it's the fault of the person who is receiving the abuse, that the abuse is happening. Jealousy is a very strong in abusers, and I think it's worth saying here that a lot of these things will show up in relationships that aren't necessarily, fully abusive, but they're all negative things to have in a relationship, and they can all build on each other to create a situation of abuse. So they're important things to work to make sure aren't part of a healthy relationship. Punishing people for time spent away, whether that's seen as a sexual problem or just a friendship problem, right? Also being jealous of people's friends for spending time with them. Abusers are often very good at emotional manipulation, including like what might feel like positive emotional manipulation, making someone feel like they are amazing and a really wonderful person. And one of the things abusers are good at doing is making the person feel like their relationship is really special and important, and that's why they have to stay in it, right? That this person is giving them all this positive emotional feedback when they are, and then also making them feel awful sometimes as well. And this, you often see this roller coaster pattern, right, where things are amazingly good, where they're really good at apologizing and making up for what they did, and then it all comes crashing down again, and the abuse returns until the person feels like they have to try and get out, and then it goes back up again to keep them in, right? And again, very rigid gender roles are something you see commonly in abusers, the belief that men and women are supposed to have particular roles in society. Again, the fact that someone believes that doesn't mean they're necessarily an abuser, but it is something that importantly shows up more commonly in abusers. So this is all very upsetting, but there's also a positive thing to say about the concept of rape culture, which is that the fact that this is cultural, the fact that this is something that all of us are participating in, means that also it can be fixed by all of us, that it can be improved by all of us, that we can come together to create a culture where survivors are supported and it is made easier for them to heal, where it is made more difficult for rapists, where they are more likely to face consequences, where it's less likely that they can perpetrate their actions, right? And so addressing rape isn't just a question of not doing it. It's not just a question of the people directly involved, it's also something all of us can participate in to create a better culture where it is less likely and less harmful, and these consequences, happen. The negative consequences that survivors face are less common, and instead that they receive the healing and support and validation that they deserve. So what works? We know that consequences work, especially consequences for kind of low-level behavior early on, right? We talked about how perpetrators often start with sexual harassment, with, just like grabbing someone's ass or something that's fairly minor, but builds up to being something if it goes unquestioned, right? If the people around them aren't saying that's not acceptable. And that brings us to bystander intervention. The idea here is that people need to step in and say that, like, it's not okay to talk about women that way. It's not okay to touch people without their consent, right? And one of the things that a number of organizations have done is to try and make sure, especially this is something that's important for men to do, right? Especially men who are in these like high male environments like sports teams, the military, in fraternities and so forth, right? They can make a real difference in setting an example and making sure that they are stopping the sort of people that will take advantage of that, right? Consent education, including from very early on, talking about consent, talking about what that is, not just sexually, but in general, right? The idea that it's not okay to force children to like hug people they don't want to, that from, the earliest age you get to make boundaries about your body and who gets to touch it when, and, talking about how important consent is to morality is something that can happen throughout the as we grow up throughout schooling. And all of the other things on the rape culture list, I won't go through them all again, but changing the way we talk about rape in jokes and so forth. And then perhaps the most important one, believing survivors, right? Understanding that if someone is coming forward, they're doing so at huge personal cost, that takes a lot of courage, and that the most important thing we can do for them is believe them, is tell them that we're listening, and that this is something that we are ready to support them in whatever way they need, and that can be lots of different things that people need. It's important to listen to what people need and not just push them to something that that you think is the right thing for them to do as a way to heal, right? But let them heal in different ways, but to believe people and accept people's truth.